Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hoping everybody is well, and I look forward to having our grand finale today as we look at part 3 of our Land of Israel in Tanakh series. I'm Rabbi Hayyim Angel. I'm the National Scholar for the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals, jewishideas.org, and we're sponsoring the three-part series just as a way of exploring, again, nothing to do with contemporary politics, but rather to explore the biblical image of the land of Israel and its religious significance overall. So we're up to part 3, which is the tail end of the biblical period as we start to look toward post-destruction of the temple and into the exile to Babylonia. The Israelites had a very dark period of despair where many of them really thought that this was the end, when suddenly the prophets of that period, Jeremiah, who lived in Israel, and Ezekiel, who lived in Babylonia, they really swung into action and saved the day. Without them, I seriously don't know where you and I would be in any capacity. But they were the ones who built up an incredible vision of hope and a foundation for being able to survive into the period of the exile. Jeremiah already said this at the time of the destruction, or hovering around the time of the destruction, in source 1 here. Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon: build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit. So he's writing a letter to Babylonia, to the Jewish community that's already there, telling them, you're not coming back too quickly. You really need to build roots there. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons. Give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. And seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord in its behalf. For in its prosperity you shall prosper. Amazingly, he even tells the Jews living in Babylonia to pray on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, saying that you need political stability, even though the Babylonians were ruthless destroyers and ended up destroying the first temple a few years after Jeremiah wrote this letter. All the same, Jeremiah is saying we need to show loyalty to the Babylonians and be patient. Then he says, for thus said the Lord, when Babylon's 70 years are over, I will take note of you, and I will fulfill to you my promise of favor to bring you back to this place, referring to the land of Israel. He says, you have 70 years, meaning your grandchildren will be the ones who return, not you. So this was a whole new idea, the idea of building up a minority Jewish community in the exile. We'd never done that before, and nobody else had done that either. It's really an amazing thing that Jeremiah was able to inspire the Jews to retain their minority Jewish status, to retain their religious beliefs and practices, and to keep a separate identity even within this big sea of the Babylonian exile. Well, he, along with Ezekiel and his prophecies of redemption, gave hope to the people. So much so that they held on for 2 generations. And sure enough, in the year 538 BCE, jumping ahead, a man named Koresh, or Cyrus, the king of Persia, simply sacked the entire Babylonian Empire almost overnight. I mean, in such quick order, you cannot believe it. And suddenly he was in charge of the now Persian Empire. The Babylonian Empire fell. Now it's the Persian Empire. And the book of Ezra, all the way toward the very end of the Bible, you have King Cyrus making a proclamation at the very beginning of the book. It's source number 2. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, when the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Any of you of all his people, may his God be with him, let him go up to Jerusalem that is in Judah and build the house of the Lord God of Israel, the God that is in Jerusalem. And all who stay behind, wherever he may be living, let the people of his place assist him with silver, gold, goods, and livestock, besides the free will offering to the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So this is just a miracle of history, and the Bible recognizes it. The author of Sefer Ezra immediately proclaims, this is what Jeremiah was saying. Jeremiah's prophecy is fulfilled. Jeremiah, speaking at the time of the destruction of the temple, which took place back in 586, and he spoke his prophecy a few years prior to that, nobody would have believed that it was possible that the Babylonians would fall and that the Jews one day would return to their homeland. And yet here we are in 538, and Cyrus is granting permission for all the Jews to return. And he even tells them that they don't have to return. They can do what they want on their own free will. Those who wish to return may return. And those who don't wish to return should write a check. They should financially support the building efforts. That's basically how he sets it up. And the Jewish people respond in great number. Chapter 2 in the book of Ezra is just a lengthy list of all the people who did choose to go back. And the tally after all of that is in source number 3, after town by town, family by family. The tally here in source 3 is the sum of the entire community was 42,360. So this sounds amazing. I mean, the book of Ezra really starts off, you feel like the Messiah is coming. Cyrus's decree was a miracle. Jeremiah's prophecy is being fulfilled. The Jews are thronging back to Jerusalem and to Israel. They're being led by a man named Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was a descendant of King David. He's part of the Davidic line and quite the legitimate future king. And he's co-leading the community with a man named Yehoshua, who was the grandson of the high priest at the time of the destruction. The high priest had been killed. His father went off into exile, and now Yehoshua is coming back. So we're dealing with righteous people, a very enthusiastic crowd. People are flooding to Jerusalem. Everything is looking right. There's one thing that's at least in question here, which the book of Ezra does not take up on the spot. It's this number of 42,360. That's a big number, but it does not reflect the entire Jewish people. Evidently, many, if not most of the Jews remained in the exile. We get a bigger picture of that from the book of Esther, which happens after the verse that we just looked at. The book of Esther, you don't feel that the Jews live in Israel at all. You don't think that there are 42,360 building up a fledgling community. You feel that the Jews live in Shushan and all over the world, but Jerusalem has no special mention, and Israel has no special mention in the book of Esther. So the impression that we get in the book of Ezra at the beginning, where it sounds like everybody is coming, they're flooding, everybody is heeding this divine call, is eclipsed by the biblical reality, which is no. A sizable community returned, but the majority, perhaps the overwhelming majority of Jews, remained behind in the exile, concentrated in Babylonia, Egypt, Shushan, Persia, and other places, but scattered throughout the empire as well. And this sets up a very interesting prophetic reflection in a visionary sense by the prophet Zechariah. Zechariah prophesied at the very beginning of the Second Temple period as the Jews were constructing the Second Temple. And so he had a series of visions, which are often cryptic and difficult to unpack, but at the very least, we can make some headway given thousands of years of scholarship, and the fact this helps too, that in many of these visions, Zechariah had an angel explain what the vision means to him. Okay, so that's very handy to us. If once the angel explains it to the prophet, so you and I can kind of read along and pick up at least whatever the prophet needed to understand. So here we go in source number 4. Here's one such vision, which is relevant to our discussion. I looked up, this is Zechariah speaking, and I saw a man holding a measuring line. So in the context here, we're dealing with Zechariah sees an angel with a tape measure, okay? Where are you going, I asked. To measure Jerusalem, he replied, to see how long and wide it is to be. But the angel who talked with me, this is a different angel. This is the one who explains Zechariah what these visions are about, came forward, and another angel came forward to meet him. The former said to him, run to that young man and tell him, the young man is Zechariah, Jerusalem shall be peopled as a city without walls. So many shall be men and cattle it contains. And I myself, declares the Lord, will be a wall of fire all around it, and I will be a glory inside it. It's a beautiful vision. So let's pause here and talk about this. The vision is of an angel measuring the boundaries of Jerusalem and saying that the population of Jerusalem is going to expand so much, it will not need walls. In fact, walls will serve to constrain the population, which is why it's good not to have walls. Oh, so what about the security aspect of walls? That's one of the reasons that people might build a wall around a city. The answer is God personally will protect the city of Jerusalem with a wall of fire. Okay, so that's a beautiful vision, and it's really, really wonderful. Now, let's talk about this. Zechariah is describing the physical reality. He's in a prophetic vision involving angels. He's in the heavenly host today. But he's describing a reality down here below, as all of his visions are. The reality down here below is that the city of Jerusalem in his time, in 520 BCE, that's when he's prophesying, the city walls are still breached. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia broke them in 586, part of his siege of Jerusalem, which led to the destruction of the first temple. Nobody has repaired these walls. The walls lie in ruins. Okay. If you ask your average Jew at that time, how does that make you feel? The answer is terribly ashamed. I speak as I never know how to describe myself anymore. My whole life I grew up in New York. Now I live in Teaneck, New Jersey. So I don't know if I'm a New Yorker who lives in Teaneck or if I'm now a New Jersey person. I never figured that one out yet. But all the same, I certainly have retained my basic New Yorker mentality in the sense of if you ask a New Yorker, what is the definition of a real city? The New Yorker, without even flinching, would say, New York City is a real city and there are no other real cities anywhere ever. Okay, that's the basic New Yorker mentality on all of this. I haven't been away for so long that I forgot that basic fact. On the good old days, the way that you defined a real city is if you have a wall around you. So the idea that Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, has its walls breached is profoundly humiliating. I'll move into the realm of halacha just for a minute for Jewish law. That's we're not having a Jewish law discourse today. Very important topics in its own right, but not what we're dealing with. But all the same, one of the most bizarre rulings of all of Jewish history in matters of Jewish law pertain to the holiday of Purim, which suddenly, let's face the facts, folks, it's on the radar. It's crazy. So Purim, you know that there are two different days on which somebody might celebrate Purim. There's the 14th day of Adar, where most Jews celebrate. And then there's the 15th day of Adar that we call Purim Shushan or Shushan Purim. Okay, then the Megillah explains, those Jews who live in walled cities celebrate on the 15th out of solidarity with Shushan. And those Jews living in open cities, meaning not real cities from a biblical perspective, they celebrate on the 14th like most of the Jewish world did then. That's cool. All right, so if you and I were the committee of Jewish law and we had to rule, well, here's a historical fact. Many cities at various points in their histories, sometimes they have walls and sometimes they don't, right? Okay, so when you define a walled city, you need to define, what does that mean? Does that mean you have a wall now? Or does that mean there has to be a moment in history at which point we declare, if you were a walled city at that moment, you are halachically a walled city. And now observe Purim Shushan on the 15th. So the sages all agreed we need to pick a moment in time. Okay, so if you and I were that committee and needed to pick that moment in time, I hope that without even blinking, I mean, if you know something, this may get in your way, but without blinking, you would say, oh, this is easy. We should pick the moment of the Purim story. Talk about no-brainers here. There's no question that it should be Jews who lived in cities that had walls at the time of the Purim story should observe Purim Shushan on the 15th day of Adar. That's the obvious choice, right? That if you have any historical sense at all, which I imagine some of us do, that's how you would rule. What other date would possibly make sense? Okay, so one rabbi in the Talmud ruled this way, but he was overwhelmingly overruled. Everybody else said, no chance, we're not ruling like you. We're going to pick the date of Joshua. That if your city had a wall at the time of Joshua, the son of Nun, this is the student of Moses, who led the people of Israel into the land of Israel, many, many centuries prior to the Purim story. Okay, that was how the sages ruled, and that is the law. Now, you got to be kidding. What in the world? Joshua is a wonderful man. I really do like him, and on some other occasion, I'm sure we'll have lots to say about him. But he has nothing to do with Purim. So this doesn't make any sense. But the sages in the Jerusalem Talmud explain what should be intuitive to everybody here in light of our discussion. The sages couldn't make the obvious ruling. They absolutely could not make the obvious ruling of saying walled cities from the time of Purim celebrate on the 15th. Because if they would have ruled that, then Jerusalem would be ruled in Jewish law not as a city, because Jerusalem's walls were breached at the time of Purim. And the sages said there is no way that Jewish law is going to enshrine Jerusalem as not a real city. Jerusalem is a real city. And therefore they picked a date that from a Purim perspective is thoroughly arbitrary. And they said, okay, if the city had a wall from the time of Joshua, great, Jerusalem was still walled then. Okay, good, we're set. Jerusalem is a walled city. Halakha can feel happy about itself, and that's why it ruled the way that it ruled. Okay, so it's an excellent ruling, but you have to understand how bizarre that is from a historical perspective, but why the sages didn't care. The sages weren't interested in a historical perspective because they could not rule that Jerusalem should count in Jewish law as a not real city. So getting back over to Zechariah's vision, the reality in Zechariah's time is that the walls were still breached. Jerusalem was humiliated. So Zechariah is saying, in a visionary sense, this need not be bad. If our population wildly expands right now, it'll be good not to have a wall, because we can expand into what you and I might think of as a new city. We don't have to be constrained by the old boundaries of the walled city. We can expand big time. If all the Jews of the exile return home, the population of Jerusalem would be too big to be contained by a wall. So now, great, it's good that we don't have a wall. What about security? God will take care of security with this wall of fire. Now, once you understand the context of Zechariah's vision in 520 BCE, when the walls were still breached, now we can move on to verse 10, still in passage in source number 4. Zechariah now suddenly says, "Away, away, flee from the land of the north, says the Lord. Though I swept you there like the four winds of heaven, declares the Lord." In other words, Zechariah realizes the only way this prophecy will be fulfilled is if all the Jews of the exile leave exile and come back to Israel. Then this will work. But if everybody remains in exile, you won't need, then you'll want a fixed wall, because suddenly Jerusalem won't be this booming population town that Zechariah envisions in the ideal sense. So verse 11, "Away, escape, O Zion, you who dwell in fair Babylon. The Lord will take Judah to himself as a portion in the Holy Land, and he will choose Jerusalem once more." Okay, so this is a prophecy. This is no longer the vision, but rather it's a basic prophecy saying that if all the Jews move back, then everything will work out. So that's Zechariah's vision. Now, the reality is most Jews did not move back. And as a result, this vision never was fulfilled. Suddenly, it was a persistent problem that the walls remained breached. And as a result, Nehemiah, who came well after Zechariah, some 75 years later, he went ahead and repaired the walls because he considered it a cherpa, or a terrible shame, that the walls had remained in disrepair. Okay, fun fact, by the way, since this is a series on Israel, in this verse 16 that we just read, the Lord will take Judah to himself as his portion in the Holy Land. That is the only place in the entire Bible where Israel is called the Holy Land. Neat, huh? Right? I mean, it's a very common expression now. Various writers have pointed out that in the 19th century, early 20th century, typically it was Christians who referred to Israel as the Holy Land, and Jews typically referred to it as Eretz Yisrael. That was the Jewish way of talking about it. All the Zionists, that's how they referred to the land, as Eretz Yisrael. Eventually, the Holy Land terminology caught on among many Jews, also not realizing that it was more commonly a Christian thing, but it's not a Christian term. It goes back to this prophecy in Zechariah. But it is critical just to note that it is the only place where you have that. Now, even though it's called the Holy Land here, and again, it's the only place in the entire Bible, let's just invoke Maimonides, Rambam, in this context. Rambam was very strong-willed on the idea of the land of Israel being a holy land. Its holiness is not inherent to the land. It's not that there's some metaphysical property in the dirt. The dirt in Israel is like any old dirt. What makes the land of Israel holy in the Bible is the fact that God designated it as the place of the covenant between God and Israel. But there's nothing about the land itself in a metaphysical sense that gives it any inherent or essential holiness. It's non-essential. It has a halachic status that renders it a holy land. And that's something which is critical not only here, but all throughout the Bible. Okay, so that's the Zechariah piece. So Zechariah spelled out a very important potential state of a breached wall, but that was never realized. Did this decision impact on when other cities did celebrate? Yes, it does. It has to do with the time of Joshua now. So cities that were walled, or that we think were walled at the time of Joshua, those are the ones that count in halakha. It's not just Jerusalem, but the ruling visibly was motivated by Jerusalem. That's what mattered one way or the other. Isn't Admat Kodesh rather than Eretz HaKodesh essentially the soil earth, not the land country? That's what the word means. But again, Rambam explains, yes, the land itself is holy, but it's not an essential property in the earth. It's not that the dirt is holy. It's that the land is holy in the context of God giving it this halachic status. There were rabbis who disagreed, but all the same. This is Rambam's view. And Rabbi Soloveitchik also in particular, very often he tried to navigate a middle path between these various disputing earlier authorities. But in this particular case, Rabbi Soloveitchik very firmly rejected the other side. He agreed with Maimonides 100% and says that there's simply no halachic way to describe inherent holiness to the land. The land is holy because God made it holy through a halachic standing. Okay. Here we go. So then we move on to the next source where this harks back to an earlier discussion we had back in week 1. Back in week 1, we talked about how, unlike the temple, where there are purification ceremonies to purify it so that God can remain within the temple amidst the people of Israel, there are no such ceremonies for the land of Israel. So if the land of Israel gets defiled, the only purification is for the land to spew out its inhabitants. And we talked about this back in week 1. That's the concept of exile in a very graphic terms that you have in the Torah itself. Okay, so now the Jews are coming back from exile, and Zechariah is navigating this point because the land has been defiled. So how are the Jews supposed to come back? So the answer is there is no ritual that will help them here. There's only one way that the land can become purified again, and that is if God himself does this. So source 5 picks that one up. For mark well this stone, which I placed before Joshua. That's not Joshua, son of Nun, that we were just talking about. This is Joshua of the Second Temple period, the high priest. A single stone with 7 eyes. I will execute its engraving, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove that country's guilt in a single day. Only God can do this. God will purge the land of all of its sin. No ritual can manage that, but God himself can do it. There's a very graphic description of God's purification process. It's not in the source sheets because it's a whole chapter, and since this is a one-off thing covering the entire Second Temple period, I didn't think it was going to work to have a whole chapter inside, but you can look it up on your own time, but I'll summarize it for you. It's Zechariah chapter 5, just 2 chapters from where we are in the source sheet. In Zechariah chapter 5, there is a 2-pronged vision that Zechariah has. The first prong basically is that God is going to smite the living daylights out of wicked people living in the land of Israel. So that's one way of eliminating the evil of the land of Israel by destroying sinners. But then the second part is a nice woman sitting in some kind of basket. And then here's the cool fact: female angels show up, meaning angels in a female form show up and schlep this woman in the tub or whatever it is, this basket, and they carry her and the tub out of Israel. So this seems to be, there's a big discussion that needs to be had when we learn Zechariah in depth together. That's not happening right now. But the bottom line that I would get to after a lot of travel through the history of interpretation is that this is actually the purification of the land of sin itself. The woman in the tub represents sin incarnate, and these angels are carrying her out of the land of Israel. So this is graphically a description of God is purifying the land of Israel. First by destroying sinners, and then by eliminating sin. Okay, so even though the people of Israel have no ceremony, no ritual to purify the land, God himself can do it. So Zechariah is paving the way for a mass return to the land of Israel, saying that if all Jews return, they won't need to rebuild their wall in Jerusalem. That's part A. And then part B is that the land will be purified of its sin, and now all the Jews can live in Israel in full purity. It's really a fabulous vision. The only thing is, the Talmud describes this in a very direct way. Messianic prophecies need our help. They don't just happen. I wish that they would just happen sometimes. It would be a lot easier if God did everything, and then we could just benefit from that. But the biblical concept of a messianic era is that we need God's help. Boy, oh boy, do we need God's help. But we also need human help. And if humans aren't doing their share, then opportunities can be lost. And so it's an amazing transition that took place. The Jews who were exiled in source 6 here, there's just a psalm from that period, they're heartbroken. They say, how can we go to the exile? How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? To them, they had a rough time fathoming how they could even continue to have a relationship with God living in the Babylonian exile. Well, 2 generations later, apparently the Jews had figured out how to do that because most of them chose to remain. So much so that Zechariah's vision of, hey, Jerusalem's population is going to explode and there's not going to be room with a wall, and therefore it's good that there is no wall or that the wall is breached. We could just expand the city now and God will protect us anyway. Or the idea that full redemption will come when all Jews return to Israel. Well, that only works if Jews buy plane tickets and go, right? And so source number 7 and 8, sources 7 and 8 in the Talmud play this point out very bluntly. Similarly, it has been taught, till thy people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over that thou hast gotten. That's a verse from the Shirat Hayyim, from the Song of the Sea, from the moment of when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and the Egyptians drowned. So this goes back to the beginnings of our peoplehood. Till thy people pass over, O Lord, this is the first entry into the land. Till all the people pass over that thou hast gotten, this is the second entry. Hence the sages say, the intention was to perform a miracle for Israel in the days of Ezra, even as it was performed for them in the days of Joshua ben Nun, but sin caused the miracle to be withheld. Okay, so this Talmudic passage keeps it vague, but it's saying that there was an opportunity for the whole messianic redemption to occur now in the story that we're in, at the beginning of the Second Temple period, but some sin blocked the complete fulfillment of redemption. And honestly, that's exactly what it sounds like in the book of Ezra, that Jeremiah's prophecy is being fulfilled. Jews are flocking to Israel, led by the right people, somebody from the Davidic line and the high priest, somebody from the high priesthood. They build the temple, they're righteous. It's the ingathering of the exiles. But now the Talmud is saying, but they didn't get to the finish line. It was a beginning of a redemption, but it was certainly not the entire thing, because some sin interfered with the final redemption process. One view in the Talmud in source number 8 tries to give an answer to what exactly the sin was. If she be a wall, we will build upon her a turret of silver. If she be a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. Had you made yourself like a wall and had all come up in the days of Ezra, you would have been compared to silver, which no rottenness can ever affect. Now that you have come up like doors, you are like cedar wood, which rottenness prevails over. So this view in the Talmud says, since the Jews didn't come en masse at the beginning of the Second Temple period, when they had this golden opportunity, which was a miracle of history, so the opportunity was squandered. Yes, they built. Yes, they even had a temple, but the temple was built rotting from within, and eventually it was destroyed. This ended up not being a full redemption at all. And so rather than having this wall of fire around Jerusalem with this expansive city, the reality was the population remained very sparse. And 75 years after Zechariah's beautiful vision, Nehemiah, the last main character in the entire Bible, rebuilt the walls with Persian blessings in 445 BCE. And the city was so sparse after that that he had to force 1/10 of the Jewish population in Israel to relocate to Jerusalem, because the city was simply not a viable city otherwise. He just needed to increase the population so that it was viable. So it was certainly not exploding at the seams and boy, oh boy, we need to expand to the new city. They needed to just have people there so that it could count as a city altogether. It was a very different reality. And so this is one predominant view within the Talmudic orbit, which later rabbinic commentaries pick up also, that the Jews simply squandered the opportunity for Mashiach to come, for the Messianic era to be full at the beginning of the Second Temple period, because many Jews, actually most Jews, did not heed the call of history. So that's that piece of the puzzle. Here comes some traffic. Were there Jewish communities in exile before the temple destruction? Yes. There's no question that some Jews already were. First of all, you had the 10 lost tribes. So you have the majority of the people of Israel don't live in Israel at the time of the destruction of the first temple, right? The 10 lost tribes were already exiled by the Assyrians considerably before the temple was destroyed. The 10 lost tribes were exiled, just to give some dates. Oops. Okay, there's that. 586 is destruction. Oops, sorry. I think you can all catch that typo, but hey, let's just spell it right for the sake of the record. Thank you. So those are the two major dates for this purpose. So were there people of Israel living outside of Israel? Oh, yes, there were many, but there were even people from the kingdom of Judah living outside of the land of Israel by now. in part because there were trade routes. So some of them already had moved on over there. And so there's no question that at least some had established business contacts outside of the land of Israel prior. I don't know if you would call those exiles in the same sense. They didn't get exiled. They weren't dragged off in chains as slaves originally. But all the same, there certainly were people living outside of the land of Israel. Okay, hold on. Okay, there's a question, a private question here. If the land wasn't so important metaphysically, why did it matter for redemption purposes where the people were located? That's a good question. The answer is once God established the land of Israel as the land of the people of Israel, that's what matters. It's a covenantal connection between God, Israel, and the land of Israel. But it's nothing about the dirt or the rocks or anything itself. It has to do with the fact that God established the nation, the country as a special place. But it's a divinely established connection via a covenant rather than anything that inheres in the land itself. Okay, so in principle, by the way, according to Maimonidean approach, if God had chosen a different nation, my friend Professor Menachem Kellner, who taught at Haifa University for many years and now teaches at the Shalem in Jerusalem. So Professor Menachem Kellner basically hypothesizes, let's say God had chosen the Navajo Indians, even though you can't use that word, the Navajos. Okay, so the promised land would be somewhere else, and the language of the Torah wouldn't be Hebrew, it would be their language. In other words, according to Rambam, there's nothing inherent in these things. It's only that God made a covenant. But once God gave the Torah to Israel, that of course makes Hebrew a sacred language. And that's because the Torah itself is sacred, and the land of Israel becomes sacred because God established this covenantal relationship there. But it didn't have to be there. That's the point. Why didn't the Shomrei Mitzvot in Babylonia consider moving to Israel? Didn't they believe the Nevi'im? That's a big question, Len. I agree, and obviously some did go, but not all of them. Many of them simply seemed to be comfortable, and they chose not to go despite being very faithful. Many of them kept the Torah, and over time built tremendous yeshivot over there. I don't need to tell you. It was a flourishing and thriving Jewish community. That all said, many of them chose to live in the diaspora rather than to come back to the land of Israel. Okay, I mean, there's more to say, but that's in the short form, that's certainly a piece of the puzzle. Okay, we now move over to the very last prophet, Malachi, who says that as the Jews who lived in Israel felt a growing sense of despair that many of their compatriots, many fellow Jews did not move back, going back to Len's question from a second ago, the Jews feel rejected. They say, maybe God just doesn't love us anymore at all. So God says, no, you don't understand. I have shown you love, said the Lord. But you ask, how have you shown us love? After all, declares the Lord, Esav is Yaakov's brother. Yet I've accepted Yaakov and rejected Esav. I have made his hills a desolation, his territory a home for beasts of the desert. If Edom thinks, though crushed, we can build the ruins again, thus said the Lord of hosts, they may build, but I will tear down. And so they shall be known as the region of wickedness, the people damned forever of the Lord. Your eyes shall behold it, and you shall declare, great is the Lord beyond the borders of Israel. So this is a great example of glass being half full. The Jews felt, even though we're in Israel again, where there's so much suffering and poverty, and most Jews haven't come back, we're all alone in this world, the Persians rule, what's going on here? God says the mere fact that I've returned you to the land of Israel is a miracle. And you should recognize that as a sign of divine love. You're right, it's not the whole redemption, but it's a big deal. And that's how God plays it up in the final prophetic book, the book of Malachi. The book of Nehemiah, which is chronologically the last biblical book, there's a prayer where the Jews at that time, in Nehemiah's time, this is again 445 BCE, that date, so they had a huge Torah re-accepting covenant that's happening in the story. It's a very beautiful passage in general, where the Jews are recommitting to keep the Torah. By now the temple has been rebuilt, the walls of Jerusalem are intact finally because Nehemiah has completed them, and they say a prayer which we recite daily. You are the Lord God who chose Abram, who brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Abraham. Finding his heart true to you, you made a covenant with him to give him the land of Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, Jebusite, and the Girgashite, to give it to his descendants. And you kept your word, for you are righteous. That was a big recognition of the Jews in the Second Temple period to say, wow, you promised that the Jews would return to the land. And sure enough, here we are. they realized that they were living the miracle. So even though the Bible doesn't end with a full messianic redemption, it ends with rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, and at least many Jews living in Israel, there's a great recognition that this is it. This is a sign of divine. This is a sign of divine love as well. I don't know. Let me see what I can do to help. Thank you for the heads up about the. Okay, I hope that helps. Okay, you always got to remember in Zoom, unless you're speaking, you got to be mute. Very important rule. So, because otherwise things get kind of noisy in the background. All right. So now it's time to tie it all together. We've gone through the biblical passages of, really from the Torah, the beginning of the Torah, the patriarchal covenant, and it comes to a complete cycle in the book of Nehemiah here, where the Jews of the Second Temple period realize, okay, we're actually the fulfillment of this great prophetic covenant to Abraham. Okay, and this brings us to an article of Professor Yehuda Elitzur, Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory. I'm just giving you the reference of where he says this. It's a collection of essays of his called Yisrael v'Hamikra. It's in Hebrew. So in one of his essays, he discusses the land of Israel, and it's a wonderful essay indeed. I just want to share a few of his ideas to wind this series down. One of the amazing things of the Torah is one of its curses. If you look at source number 13 over here, it says here, I will make the land desolate. If you sin and continue to be unfaithful, I will make the land desolate so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled by it. And you I will scatter among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword against you. Your land shall become a desolation, and your cities a ruin. That sounds pretty horrible, because it is pretty horrible. The idea of an exile and destruction, desolation, you're going to be scattered among the nations. These are all terrible things, and they are intended as curses. Don't get anybody wrong here. But Professor Elitzur says that there is a silver lining here that you would never know from reading the passage in Leviticus chapter 26, where it's just as bleak as it goes. But other commentaries picked it up already in the medieval period. There's not just the writings of a 20th century Zionistic scholar here. Radak and others already picked it up in the 13th century. There's Rabbi David Kimchi. That's just Radak, just stands for that. He points out that this curse has a blessing in it, which is when the Jews go into exile, the land will remain desolate. Nobody else will take it over. So he points this out, and several other commentators point this out as well. And this just brings back what you have in source 11, when God told Abraham at the very beginning, I assign the land you sojourn in to you and your offspring to come in all the land of Canaan as an everlasting holding. I will be their God. So as we discussed back in week 1, it is an everlasting holding. Even if the people of Israel get exiled from their land, the land still belongs to the people of Israel. It's an amazing idea. Usually speaking, you get exiled by a conquering power, that's it. You don't have any more title. You've lost it forever. But God is saying, as part of this eternal covenant with Abraham, no, the land of Israel doesn't work according to the normal rules of the nations. That in fact, this land always will belong to the people of Israel. And as a blessing of that, it will remain desolate. It's actually interesting that it did. Before the Israelites came in the first place in the time of Joshua, at least the Canaanites, who were never one united nation, the one thing that they did know how to do is grow good olives and figs and dates and stuff like that. Source 12 is one of many examples I could quote from, where God is trying to hype up the people of Israel who are about to enter the land. Hey, you're about to enter a beautiful land. When the Lord your God, this is source 12, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to assign to you, great and flourishing cities that you did not build, houses full of all good things that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, and you eat your fill. In other words, the Canaanites developed the land very nicely, so that when the Israelites enter the land, it will be well-built, well-developed, agriculturally rich, all these good things. Oh, thank you, Myron. I switched them around in my notes. That's why it's a different numbering system. I apologize. Yeah, source 13. Thank you, Myron. Okay, so anyway, the point is that the Canaanites were able to never form one united nation. We call them the Canaanites, but the reality is there were many, many different city-states that all hated each other and fought against each other all the time before we ever showed up. What makes the land of Israel unique in this regard is the Canaanites never could have one nation, but at least they grew good olives. The Israelites showed up as one nation and were able to develop the land. But once they leave, once they are exiled, nobody since was able to build up the land at all. No nation took over the land. Nobody grew any more. The fertility of the land completely became a barren wasteland. In the 13th century, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman he was in Barcelona in what became Spain. So Ramban basically had to flee Spain for all the kinds of historical reasons back then. And he came over to the land of Israel toward the very end of his life. And when he got there, he was flabbergasted by how totally void and desolate the land was. Here he spent his whole life in Spain reading about a land flowing with milk and honey. And then he gets there and it's a dump. So in his commentary on Leviticus 26, he added some comments to what he had written when he was still in Spain. He says, I see the desolation in Israel as proof of God's promise that the land eternally belongs to the Jewish people, and God will return all of us here one day. Because under normal circumstances, lands don't remain desolate. When they are conquered, somebody moves in. It's like there's some great real estate to be had. It's a fertile, wonderful, lush place. Somebody should take it over, whether Babylonians or just other people noticing that nobody can protect it anymore. It's free natural resources. Go on in there. That's the normal way of the land. But in this case, Ramban, many centuries after the land lay waste, realized, nobody's come in to build it up. The place is a dump. It's a barren wasteland. But this proves what God said in his curses, that the land will remain desolate until the people of Israel come back. And then, of course, the celebrated passage by Mark Twain, different type of writer, but all the same. It's in a collection. He wrote this first, and then it was incorporated into a collection of his essays called The Innocents Abroad. So Mark Twain, when he did some travels, that's part of the abroad part, he came along to other places to the land of Israel, and he was flabbergasted by what a dump the land of Israel was in the 19th century. And so you can get all this stuff online already, right? A desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. We never saw a human being on the whole route. I mean, he's describing it, it's just empty. There's weeds, there's no fertility, there's almost no people. There was hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. He couldn't believe how barren it was. Like, what a lost land, he says. So Twain, writing in the 19th century, is simply, he didn't bring it home to the covenantal point that Ramban brings up. I'm not surprised. But he couldn't believe it was such a total dump. So Professor Yehuda Elitzur, in his essay, I'm expanding on what he's saying, as you can see, but all the same, he brings the same point home, that even though the promise of exile and desolation is terrible, it's part of the curses, it comes with a silver lining, which is the land of Israel is waiting for the people of Israel to come home. And then Professor Elitzur goes on to a second point, the idea of the Jewish people being scattered among the nations in that curse in source number 12. For me, it's 13, but for you, it should still be source number 12, Leviticus chapter 26. That normally speaking in history, when people get exiled, one of two things happens. If they are a small people, they simply assimilate into the dominant culture. If they are a big people, they could take over the land where they go. Think about the British people coming to what is now America. Okay, so a lot of them came in one concentrated place. And so they were able to culturally dominate a region. Or think about Spain and Argentina. Okay, so instead of just being taken over by the locals, they became the dominant population, the dominant culture. So that could happen. If enough people come with enough power, they can actually take over the culture of a region and develop some kind of homeland over there. So Professor Elitzur says that the idea that the people of Israel will be scattered among the nations is terrible. But that also means that we will retain our religious cultural identity wherever we go. And B, we won't be able to take over anybody else's land and make Torah culture that land's culture. In other words, we never will be able to build up a different land as our homeland. Okay, let me just write this. Roberts, okay, thank you. Land without a people for a people without a land. Excellent. So what Myron is saying now is something that Professor Elitzur is going to say, not in as catchy a way, but all the same, he brings home a very similar point. Professor Elitzur says that the theology of the land of Israel in the Torah is that the people of Israel and the land of Israel need one another. When they are together, everything is right. The people flourish and the land flourishes. But if the people of Israel are exiled from their land and then they become scattered among the nations, always a minority, and the land of Israel becomes totally desolate. In other words, it lost its batteries too. So the whole Bible really sets out a critical point, which is that the Torah itself applies everywhere. The Jewish people are bound by the Torah wherever they live at any point. The people of Israel for all time. But the ideal state of the covenantal relationship between God and Israel, of course, is the land of Israel. And that's the place of the fulfillment of the covenant from the time of Abraham all the way down through Nehemiah in the Bible, and then, of course, all the way down to the present as well. So the miracle of today, just to close out on the modern state of Israel. So the founding of the modern state of Israel visibly is a fulfillment of a miracle. I mean, this is the ancient covenant with Abraham, and the idea that the land remained desolate so that the Jewish people one day can come back in and build it up again is, we see it with our own eyes, what a miracle of history we are able to witness, regardless of where you and I happen to live at this moment. It's nothing short of a miracle. There are two components that we walk away with. One is the sheer gratitude we should have to God for living in such a miraculous time, that at least the beginning of the redemptive process has begun. But it's also a challenge. The state of Israel is not just a gift, it's also a challenge to Jews worldwide to merit God's covenant and to be able to actually fulfill what the prophets called upon the people of Israel to do in keeping the land of Israel sacred and keeping the land of Israel among our people. There's a lot more to be said, of course, but in a three-part series, I think we've done quite a lot in our journey. And I just want to turn over to the traffic for a second, and then I'll wrap it up. Well, we did so in a microway, i.e. important cities in Europe, enclaves in the USA like New Jersey, et cetera. We certainly formed strong communities in various places. That is definitely true. I don't think we can ever say, I don't think it could ever be said that we became, the New Jersey culture is now Jews or Judaism. There's no question that we play a role and that we have influence, but that's very, very different from English people coming over and essentially building up a little England on foreign shores, or Spain building up another Spain in Argentina. Of course, you're right, though. We've built up very strong communities, throughout our history in various places where enough Jews lived to have such a strong thing. It's important for us to say Medinat Yisrael, the Jewish sovereignty. I completely agree with you. I'm certainly not trying to avoid that term in any stretch of the imagination. It's a miracle that the land of Israel and that there's a state of Israel where Jews actually can finally have self-rule again. It's both a miracle, but also a challenge to all of us to live up to the biblical covenantal relationship that God wants us to have with the land of Israel. On that very happy note, I really want to thank the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. Even in a COVID era, we've been able to promote our vision throughout the world, and Zoom certainly is a helpful thing on that. We thank all of those of you who are members and supporters of our work. If you are not yet, please go to jewishideas.org, which is on your source sheet anyway, but I'll put it here as well. You can learn more about our work, just sign up, become part of our family. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy day to come and learn and really spend some time together learning about the religious status of the land of Israel, within the biblical orbit. On that very happy note, I look forward to learning with you more in the future. Stay tuned for more announcements for future Zoom classes, and one day even maybe in-person classes, although I think the world of Zoom was not going to leave us anytime. I think it's great that we have this opportunity, that we can connect to people all over the place rather than just in one spot. It's good to see old friends, new friends, and people I don't recognize at all. That's the way learning Torah should always be. And I wish you all good health and happiness. And until the next time, Kol Tuv, thank you so much and take care.
Thank you very much,
Chazak
Rabbi.
Baruch.
Chodesh
Rabbi.
Tov.
All the best.
Drishat Shalom.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Angel.
I thought that quote was from Chara